Some rivers remember every secret ever whispered to them. But on rare evenings, they choose to whisper one back. The sun was sinking behind the cottonwood trees, turning the slow river into a ribbon of molten copper. Shadows stretched across the tall prairie grass while the evening wind carried the scent of wet earth, horse leather, and distant sage. Caleb Harper loosened the reins of his old bay gelding and guided it toward the shallow bank, expecting nothing more than another quiet sunset after another long day driving cattle across the valley. His horse stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. The animal's ears shot forward. Every muscle beneath its dusty hide tightened like a drawn bowstring. It refused to place another hoof into the water. Caleb frowned. Dusty. The horse answered with a nervous snort, eyes fixed somewhere across the river. Caleb had trusted this horse through blizzards, mountain lions, flash floods, and nights darker than coal. Dusty had never feared running water, which meant it wasn't the river. It was something inside it. Caleb followed the horse's stare. At first, he saw only ripples glowing beneath the fading light. Then a figure slowly emerged from the reflection. A young Apache woman stood knee-deep in the current. She wasn't moving. Her dark hair drifted lightly with the breeze, untouched by the water around her. The fading sunlight painted the beaded edges of her buckskin dress with threads of gold. One hand rested gently against the neck of a white horse drinking quietly beside her, as though both had been standing there long before the evening arrived. She looked almost unreal, not because she was beautiful, because nothing around her behaved the way it should. The current curled around her legs without splashing. The birds perched silently above the riverbank. Even the insects that had filled the air only moments before seemed to vanish into the coming dusk. Caleb took one cautious step forward. The woman raised her eyes. Their gazes met across the narrow stretch of water. There was no fear in her expression, no surprise, only the strange calm of someone who had already expected him to arrive. Dusty suddenly pawed at the ground. Hard. Once. Twice. The sound echoed against the stillness. The woman slowly lifted one finger to her lips. Not as a warning, as a plea. Her voice barely rose above the murmur of the river. If your horse still trusts you. She paused. The words hung in the cooling air longer than they should have. Don't look behind. Caleb felt the blood drain from his face. Every instinct born from 20 years on the frontier screamed for him to spin around. His hand drifted toward the worn colt resting against his hip. But Dusty did something Caleb had never seen before. The old horse lowered its head, closed its eyes, and stood perfectly still. Then came the sound, a faint metallic click, the unmistakable whisper of a revolver's hammer being pulled back. Close enough for Caleb to hear. Close enough for someone to kill him before he ever turned around. The river continued flowing as though nothing had changed. The Apache woman never looked away. Neither of them spoke again. Some silences arrived before death. Others arrived before destiny. Caleb had no way of knowing which one had just stepped quietly onto the riverbank behind him. The hammer never fell. Caleb stood motionless, every muscle locked beneath the weight of a silence so complete he could hear the river sliding around smooth stones. His fingers rested lightly on the worn grip of his colt, but he made no attempt to draw it. 20 years on the frontier had taught him that the fastest hand was rarely the one that lived the longest. Behind him, someone exhaled. Slowly, deliberately. Then came the sound of boots shifting across damp sand. One step. Another. The revolver was still there. Close enough to end everything. Easy, a man's voice finally said. Low. Controlled. Reach for that gun, and your horse dies before you do. Caleb didn't answer. Dusty remained perfectly still, his eyes half closed, trusting the man who had raised him since he was a frightened colt. Across the river, the Apache woman watched every movement without blinking. She shook her head ever so slightly. Not fear. Instruction. Caleb understood. He slowly lifted both hands away from his belt. The stranger behind him gave a quiet chuckle. Smarter than most. The pressure eased. Not much. Just enough. Caleb turned. The man standing 20 feet away wore no badge, no military coat, no tribal markings. His weathered jacket carried too much dust for a merchant and too many hidden pockets for an honest rancher. Gray streaks ran through his beard, while cold blue eyes studied everything with the patience of a wolf choosing the weakest elk in the herd. His revolver never wavered. You hunting somebody? Caleb asked calmly. The stranger smiled. I'm collecting something. What? A girl. Caleb glanced toward the river. The Apache woman hadn't moved. The stranger followed his eyes. There she is. Something inside Caleb tightened. The way the man said those words sounded wrong. Not like someone searching for family. Like someone claiming property. What did she steal? Caleb asked. The man laughed softly. Nothing. Then why chase her? Because she carries something that belongs to people richer than either of us. The answer only deepened the mystery. Caleb looked back toward the river. For the first time, he noticed the small leather satchel hanging across the young woman's shoulder. It looked ordinary, old, weathered by years beneath sun and rain. Certainly not valuable enough to risk killing over. Unless what rested inside couldn't be measured in gold. The stranger stepped closer. I don't care about the Apache girl. His voice became quieter. I care about that bag. Across the water, the young woman finally moved. Not backward. Not toward safety. She walked deeper into the river until the current reached her waist. Every ripple reflected the last orange light of evening around her like liquid fire. Then she did something neither man expected. She removed the satchel, held it high above the water, and looked directly at Caleb. Don't let him have it. Her English was clear, soft, without panic, as though she had already accepted whatever happened next. The stranger's smile disappeared. His revolver lifted another inch. Throw it here, he ordered. She ignored him. Instead, she kept watching the cowboy on the opposite bank. Not the gun, not the outlaw, only Caleb. It was the kind of look shared between two strangers forced to trust one another before either had learned the other's name. The evening breeze swept across the river, carrying the scent of wet willow branches and distant rain. Far away, a hawk cried once before disappearing into the darkening sky. Then Dusty suddenly threw back his head and let out a violent, desperate neigh. Not toward the armed man, toward the tree line beyond him. The stranger heard it too. His expression changed. For the first time since arriving, uncertainty flickered across his face. A heartbeat later, another sound drifted through the cottonwoods. Hoofbeats. Not one rider. Many. Still too distant to count. Close enough to make every choice suddenly matter. The hoofbeats rolled across the valley like distant thunder, growing louder with every passing second. The armed stranger turned his head only slightly, listening. Not nervous. Calculating. A man who survived by measuring danger instead of fearing it. Caleb studied him in silence. Most outlaws looked impatient. This one looked prepared. His revolver remained steady, but his eyes kept drifting toward the leather satchel in the Apache woman's hands. Nothing else mattered to him. Not Caleb. Not the horse. Certainly not the woman herself. Only the satchel. The realization settled deep inside Caleb's chest. Whatever rested inside that weathered leather bag was worth more than blood. Across the river, the young woman stood unmoving beneath the fading light. The current pushed gently against her buckskin dress, yet she held the satchel high with unwavering hands. Her eyes found Caleb again. Right away, she called quietly. You don't even know me, Caleb answered. I know enough. The stranger laughed. Listen to her, cowboy. Walk away, and you'll still see tomorrow. Caleb ignored him. Instead, he spoke to the woman. What's your name? For the first time since they met, uncertainty crossed her face. She hesitated, almost as though giving her name carried its own danger. Finally, she answered, Aiyana. The name drifted across the river as softly as evening mist. My name's Caleb. She nodded once. I know. The word struck him harder than any drawn gun. You know me? Her gaze lowered briefly toward Dusty before returning to Caleb. Your horse told me. The stranger burst into laughter. I knew Apache stories were strange, but talking horses? Caleb didn't laugh. Neither did Aiyana. Dusty lifted his head and stared at her with remarkable calm, as though recognizing someone he had met long before this evening. The old gelding took one slow step toward the water, then another. The fear that had frozen him moments earlier was gone. Caleb had seen horses judge storms before clouds formed. He had seen them refuse trails where mountain lions waited in silence. Animals often sensed what people could not. Dusty trusted her now. That was enough for Caleb. The stranger's smile faded as he noticed the horse moving. I've wasted enough time. His revolver shifted toward Aiyana. Throw me the satchel. She gently shook her head. If I do. Her voice barely rose above the flowing river. Hundreds of people will die. The evening seemed to stop breathing. Even the stranger's finger loosened slightly around the trigger. What did you say? I said what you already know. The man narrowed his eyes. You've opened it. No. Then how do you know? My father told me never to. The stranger took another cautious step closer to the riverbank. So your father knew. Aiyana remained silent. The silence itself became an answer. Caleb looked between them, trying to piece together a puzzle whose edges he could barely see. No gold. No jewels. No stolen money. Whatever lay inside that satchel frightened men who carried revolvers and women who walked willingly into rivers. The hoofbeats were much closer now. Several riders. Heavy horses. Disciplined pace. Not a frightened posse. Not drunken bandits. Someone organized. The stranger heard them too. His expression hardened. Damn it. Without warning, he reached beneath his coat and pulled out a second revolver. One aimed at Caleb. One aimed at Aiyana. If I can't leave with that satchel, he said coldly, none of us leave this river. Aiyana slowly closed her eyes. Not in surrender. In prayer. The wind shifted. It carried the smell of cedar smoke from somewhere beyond the cottonwood trees. Caleb noticed something strange. Aiyana wasn't facing the gun anymore. She was listening to something beyond the approaching riders. Then she opened her eyes and whispered only 4 words. They found us first. Before Caleb could ask what she meant, shadows began emerging between the trees on the opposite ridge. Not one rider. Not 5. An entire line of horsemen appeared against the crimson horizon, riding without a single voice, their silhouettes dark beneath the dying sun. And every one of them wore the feathers of Apache warriors. The Apache riders came without a war cry. That frightened Caleb more than shouting ever could. Nearly 30 horsemen emerged from the crimson ridge in perfect silence, their silhouettes framed by the dying sun. Their horses descended the slope at an even pace, neither rushing nor hesitating, as though every hoof already knew exactly where it belonged. No dust clouds, no reckless charge, only discipline. The armed stranger cursed beneath his breath. So they found us. His confidence, so steady only moments before, cracked for the first time. Caleb noticed it immediately. The revolver was still aimed at Aiyana, but the stranger's eyes had begun measuring escape instead of victory. Aiyana lowered the satchel against her chest. They're not here for me, she whispered. They're here for him. Before Caleb could ask what she meant, the lead Apache rider raised one hand. Every horse stopped at once. Not one step farther. The silence that followed carried more weight than 1,000 rifles. The chief dismounted slowly. His hair was streaked with silver, his shoulders wrapped in a weathered buffalo robe darkened by years of wind and smoke. Deep lines crossed his face, but his eyes remained sharp enough to unsettle any man who met them. He did not look at Aiyana. He did not look at Caleb. He looked only at the stranger. I've crossed 3 valleys for you, Victor Hale. The stranger smiled faintly. So you finally learned my name. I learned it from widows. The words landed like stones. I learned it from children who buried fathers. Victor's expression hardened. You came a long way just to give a speech. The chief ignored the insult. You've hunted that satchel for 6 days. You know what's inside. I know enough. Victor slowly backed toward his horse without lowering either revolver. You don't. His voice became strangely calm. None of you do. He glanced toward Caleb, especially the cowboy. Caleb met his stare without speaking. Victor continued. Ask yourself why an Apache chief would ride through half the territory for an old leather bag. Caleb looked toward Aiyana. She remained silent. Her fingers tightened around the worn straps. The satchel looked ordinary. Its leather was cracked. The stitching had been repaired more than once. Nothing about it suggested wealth. Yet men were willing to kill and ride for days to possess it. The chief finally turned toward Caleb. You are free to leave. The word surprised everyone. This is not your fight. Caleb considered the offer. He looked at Dusty, who stood peacefully beside the river. He looked at Aiyana, whose eyes carried exhaustion far older than her years. Then he looked at Victor Hale, whose fingers rested too comfortably on 2 loaded revolvers. Caleb slowly shook his head. It became my fight the moment someone pointed a gun at my horse. For the first time that evening, a faint smile appeared beneath the chief's weathered face. Aiyana closed her eyes briefly, almost relieved. Victor laughed. Honor. He spat into the river. Men die from that disease every day. He suddenly reached inside his coat with one hand. Every Apache warrior tensed. Caleb's hand dropped instinctively toward his Colt. But Victor wasn't drawing another weapon. He pulled out a folded sheet of yellowed paper. Holding it high, he smiled toward the chief. "You've all been chasing the wrong prize." He tossed the paper into the air. The evening wind caught it, carrying it toward the middle of the river. Every eye followed it. For one fatal heartbeat, Victor moved. He fired once, not at the chief, not at Caleb. The bullet struck the leather strap of Aiyana's satchel. The strap snapped apart. The bag spun from her hands, splashed into the river, and vanished beneath the dark current. Without hesitation, Aiyana dove after it. At the very same instant, Victor leaped onto his horse and drove his spurs forward. Everything that had remained silent until now exploded into motion. The river swallowed the satchel without a sound. One heartbeat it was there. The next, it was gone beneath the copper-colored current. "Aiyana." Caleb's voice echoed across the water as she disappeared after it, her dark hair vanishing beneath the surface like a shadow pulled into another world. Everything erupted. Victor Hale's horse lunged up the riverbank, its iron shoes tearing into the wet earth. He fired another shot over his shoulder, not to kill, but to force the Apache riders to scatter. They didn't. The warriors split with practiced precision, half pursuing Victor while the others rushed toward the river. The old chief never moved. His eyes remained fixed on the water, as if he feared the river more than the outlaw. Caleb threw off his gun belt and boots without thinking. Then he dove. The cold struck like winter steel. The current was stronger than it had looked from shore, dragging branches and loose stones beneath the dark surface. Mud clouded the water until he could barely see his own hands. He searched blindly. Nothing. Only drifting weeds. A broken leather strap floated past his face. He grabbed it. The satchel had torn free completely. Then he saw her. Aiyana was trapped beneath an uprooted cottonwood lodge between two massive rocks. Her buckskin sleeve had caught on a broken branch, while one hand still reached desperately into a narrow crack beneath the roots. Not for herself. For the satchel. She refused to let it go. Caleb kicked harder, fighting the current until his lungs burned. He reached her just as she pulled something loose from beneath the tangled roots. The leather bag. She pushed it toward him first. Not toward the surface. Toward him. "Take it." Bubbles escaped with the words. Caleb shook his head and grabbed her arm instead. She resisted. Fiercely. Again she forced the satchel against his chest. "Please." There was something in her eyes stronger than fear. Duty. The kind carried by people who believed their own lives mattered less than the promise they had sworn to protect. Caleb understood. He looped the satchel over his shoulder before wrapping one arm around Aiyana's waist. With the other, he tore her sleeve free from the branch. The current seized them instantly. For one terrifying moment, neither knew which way was up. Then a beam of fading sunlight pierced the muddy water. Caleb kicked toward it. His lungs screamed. His vision blurred. Just as darkness began closing around the edges of his sight, they broke through the surface together. Air. Sweet. Cold. Alive. Apache warriors rushed into the shallows, pulling both of them onto the gravel bank. Aiyana coughed violently, water spilling across the stones. The satchel remained strapped across Caleb's shoulder. The chief dropped to one knee beside her. He placed one weathered hand gently against her forehead. No words. Only relief. Caleb lay on his back, staring at the darkening sky while Dusty nudged his shoulder with a trembling nose. The old horse had walked into the river on his own, as though refusing to leave his master behind. Then came another sound. Not the river. Not the horses. Gunfire. Farther upstream. Sharp. Rapid. The Apache warriors instantly reached for bows and rifles. One young scout galloped down from the northern ridge so hard his exhausted horse nearly collapsed beneath him. He slid to the ground before the chief. Victor didn't run, the scout said between heavy breaths. He met someone. The chief's face grew still. Who? The scout swallowed. United States Cavalry. Silence settled over the riverbank. Caleb slowly sat up. Victor Hale had not been fleeing the Apache. He had been riding toward someone. Toward allies. Toward men who were also waiting for the satchel. The chief looked at Caleb for the first time since the rescue. There are no longer two sides hunting that bag. He paused, listening to the distant echoes rolling through the valley. There are three. And somewhere beyond the hills, another volley of rifle fire shattered the evening. sounding less like the beginning of a battle, and more like someone trying desperately to erase the truth before it could ever be read. The truth weighed less than a pound, yet men were willing to bury entire valleys to keep it hidden. Night settled quietly over the Apache camp. Small fires flickered beneath towering cottonwood trees, sending ribbons of cedar smoke into a sky crowded with stars. Horses grazed in silence beyond the circle of light, while warriors spoke in low voices that blended with the steady murmur of the river. Caleb sat apart from them, drying the worn leather satchel beside the fire. It looked even older now. Water had darkened every stitch. The flap was tied shut with a faded strip of rawhide that no one had dared untie. Not even the chief. Aiyana approached carrying a wooden cup filled with hot sage tea. She offered it without speaking. Caleb accepted with a quiet nod. For several moments, neither of them said a word. The fire cracked softly between them. Finally, Caleb looked at the satchel. You've carried this all the way here. Yes. You almost drowned for it. Yes. And you still won't tell me what's inside. A faint smile touched her face. It's not because I don't trust you. Then why? She watched sparks drift into the darkness before answering. Because once you know, you'll never be allowed to forget. The words settled heavily between them. Caleb had heard many warnings during his years on the frontier. None sounded like that one. Across the camp, the old chief slowly walked toward them. His weathered boots barely disturbed the dust. He lowered himself beside the fire with the careful movements of a man carrying too many years upon his shoulders. For a long while he studied Caleb in silence. Then he reached into his coat. Caleb instinctively tensed. The chief removed not a weapon, but a small silver key. It hung from a leather cord polished smooth by decades of use. This key has belonged to my family since before my grandfather was born. He placed it gently beside the satchel. No one has opened that bag since the day it was sealed. Caleb frowned. Then how do you know what's inside? I don't. The answer surprised him. I only know what it protects. The old chief's eyes reflected the firelight. When I was a boy, my father made me swear that if every warrior died, if every village burned, if every child was left alone. He rested, one trembling hand on the satchel. This would still reach the governor. Aiyana lowered her head. Caleb looked from the chief to the satchel and back again. A peace treaty? The chief remained silent. Silence, Caleb was beginning to learn, often meant yes. Then why would the cavalry want it destroyed? No one answered immediately. Instead, Aiyana quietly reached into the fire with a stick, moving one burning log aside. The flames shifted. Light fell across the chief's scarred face. Because peace is expensive. He spoke without anger. War earns certain men more. The camp fell quiet again. Far away, an owl called from the hills. Caleb stared into the fire, turning those words over in his mind. He had seen ranchers lose land to dishonest contracts. He had watched politicians promise protection while selling grazing rights behind closed doors. But a document powerful enough to stop a war, that was something else entirely. Aiyana looked directly at him. Tomorrow we ride east. To the governor? She nodded. If the treaty reaches his hands before the soldiers do. Her voice trailed away. Caleb finished the thought. Thousands may live. For the first time that evening, Aiyana smiled without sadness. It transformed her face completely. Not because it was beautiful, because it carried hope. A hope she had protected across mountains, rivers, and gunfire. The chief carefully picked up the silver key again. Then, to Caleb's astonishment, he placed it into the cowboy's hand. Warm, unexpectedly heavy. You saved the keeper. He looked toward Aiyana. You saved the treaty. Then he closed Caleb's fingers around the key. Now fate has chosen a third guardian. Before Caleb could return it, a horn echoed through the darkness from the northern ridge. One long blast. Then another. Every Apache warrior rose to his feet. A scout came racing into camp, his horse covered in white foam. He didn't even dismount. The cavalry is marching tonight, he shouted. They're not riding to intercept us. His voice broke as he looked toward the chief. They already know exactly where we're going. Some choices are made with a trigger. The ones that change history are made by laying the weapon down. Before dawn, the Apache camp had already vanished. No tents remained. No cooking fires. Only faint circles of ash and hoofprints fading into the cold morning grass. The entire band moved east through a narrow canyon, where towering cliffs swallowed the first light of sunrise. Every rider kept silent. Even the horses seemed to understand that noise had become an enemy. Caleb rode beside Aiyana. The weathered satchel rested securely across his shoulder. The small silver key lay inside his vest pocket, heavier than iron despite weighing almost nothing. Dusty walked with unusual caution. Twice the old gelding stopped to sniff the wind. Twice he refused the wider trail. The chief never questioned him. "Follow the horse," he ordered quietly. An hour later they understood why. Fresh cavalry tracks crossed the main pass. More than 50 horses. Had they continued along that route, they would have ridden directly into an ambush. Several warriors exchanged uneasy glances. The chief simply nodded toward Dusty. Animals hear what pride cannot. The journey continued through a hidden ravine where cedar trees clung to stone walls blackened by centuries of wind. The air smelled of pine resin and damp earth. Water dripped from cracks high above, echoing like distant footsteps. Then Caleb saw movement. Far ahead, a line of blue uniforms emerged at the canyon's narrowest point. United States Cavalry. Rifles rested across their saddles. Their commander urged his horse forward until he stood alone in the center of the trail. He removed his hat. "I am Captain Elias Mercer." His voice carried clearly through the canyon. "We're not here for blood." The chief remained mounted. "Then leave." Mercer sighed. "I can't." His eyes settled on the leather satchel. "Hand it over." "No. It belongs to the government." The chief answered calmly. "It belongs to the truth." Silence stretched between the two groups. No rifle moved. No horse shifted. Only the wind wandered through the canyon. Captain Mercer finally looked toward Caleb. "You don't belong here, cowboy." Caleb said nothing. "You still have a choice." Mercer's expression softened. "Right away. Nobody will follow. You've done enough." Caleb glanced toward Aiyana. She never asked him to stay, never begged, never reached for his hand. She only watched him with tired eyes that accepted whatever answer he gave. That somehow made the decision harder. Mercer spoke again. "You're risking your life for people you met yesterday." Caleb slowly removed the satchel from his shoulder. Every Apache warrior stiffened. Several cavalry rifles rose an inch. Aiyana's breathing caught. The chief lowered his eyes. Not in disappointment. In understanding. Caleb stepped down from Dusty. The canyon became perfectly still. He walked halfway between both groups, carrying the satchel in one hand. Captain Mercer smiled faintly. "I knew you'd make the sensible choice." Caleb stopped. 20 feet separated him from the captain. 20 feet separated him from the Apache. He looked at the satchel, then at the silver key in his hand. Finally, he looked directly into Mercer's eyes. "My father taught me something." Mercer waited. "If a man asks you to hide the truth." Caleb slowly placed both the satchel and the key onto a flat stone in the middle of the trail. "He's already afraid of it." He stepped back, far away from both sides. No weapon in his hands. No claim to the satchel. No protection. Only trust. The canyon fell silent enough to hear water dripping from the cliffs. Mercer's smile disappeared. The chief stared at Caleb without blinking. Neither side moved toward the stone, because the first man who reached for it would become the one who chose violence. Then Aiyana quietly dismounted. Without looking at either army, she walked toward the stone alone, unarmed. The morning wind lifted a strand of her dark hair across her face as she reached for the satchel. At that exact moment, Captain Mercer slowly drew his revolver, and so did Victor Hale, stepping from behind the cavalry line where no one had realized he had been hiding all along. The first man to lower his gun was never the weakest. He was the one who feared the truth the least. Captain Elias Mercer's revolver cleared its holster with practiced speed. Victor Hale's pistol rose beside it almost at the same ends. History rarely remembers the loudest gunshot. More often, it remembers the quiet hand that refused to pull the trigger. 3 days later, the governor's residence stood beneath a pale autumn sky, its white walls catching the first light of morning. Soldiers lined the entrance, their polished boots scraping softly against the stone courtyard as Captain Elias Mercer dismounted beside Caleb Harper. No chains bound Victor Hale. His wounded hand rested in a sling, and 2 cavalrymen walked beside him without forcing his steps. For the first time in years, he would answer not to revenge, but to the law. The old Apache chief climbed slowly from his horse. Age seemed heavier now, not because of the long journey, Because the burden he had carried for decades was almost over. Aiyana walked beside him, the weathered satchel cradled carefully in both hands. Every stitch of its cracked leather had survived rivers, bullets, storms, and betrayal. Now only a few wooden doors remained between the satchel and its destination. Inside the governor's chamber, no one spoke as the silver key turned inside the ancient lock. The leather flap opened. The oilcloth was unfolded. The wax seal remained untouched. The governor himself broke it. Silence filled the room while his eyes moved across the faded ink. Once, then again, his expression slowly changed. Disbelief, sorrow, understanding. He lowered the document with trembling hands. This treaty, his voice barely carried across the room, was accepted. No one answered. It bears the signatures of both territorial representatives and Apache leaders. He looked toward the chief. It should have prevented the military campaign 23 years ago. The old chief quietly nodded. It almost did. The governor turned toward Victor Hale. You stole this. Victor lowered his eyes. I was paid. By whom? Victor hesitated for only a moment. Men who made fortunes selling supplies for a war they didn't want to end. No one spoke after that. Some truths arrived too late to erase the past, but not too late to change the future. Weeks passed. Investigations spread through the territory. Corrupt contracts disappeared. Several officials resigned. Some faced trial. Captain Mercer removed his commission voluntarily, choosing to testify instead of protecting his career. People called him foolish. He slept better than he had in years. As for Caleb, he returned to his ranch exactly as he had left it. The fences still needed mending. The cattle still wandered farther than they should. Dusty still demanded apples every evening before entering the stable. The world looked almost unchanged. Almost. One quiet afternoon near the beginning of spring, Caleb rode once more to the same river where everything had begun. The water flowed gently beneath the cottonwood branches. Birdsong drifted through the warm air. Dusty stopped at the familiar place. This time not from fear, from memory. Caleb climbed down from the saddle and stood beside the river for a long while. Then he noticed something resting upon the smooth stone where the satchel had once lain. A single eagle feather, bound with blue thread. No footprints surrounded it. No horse tracks marked the soft earth. Only the feather. He smiled. Not because he expected her to appear. Because he understood she had already kept her promise. A voice carried softly across the river. Not loud. Barely louder than the breeze. When your horse trusted you. Caleb looked up. Aiyana stood beneath the cottonwood trees on the opposite bank, dressed in the same buckskin clothing, sunlight dancing along the beadwork at her sleeves. I knew I could. Neither crossed the river. Neither needed to. Some distances are meant to remain. Not because hearts are divided. Because respect sometimes speaks more deeply than possession. They stood there in comfortable silence while the river continued carrying yesterday toward tomorrow. Dusty lowered his head to drink. Aiyana smiled at the old horse first, then at Caleb. Finally, she turned and disappeared into the whispering trees without another word. The eagle feather remained on the stone. Caleb picked it up carefully and tucked it inside his hatband. Years later, children would hear different stories about that valley. Some would say a cowboy saved an Apache woman. Others would insist an Apache woman saved a cowboy. The river never corrected either version, because it had witnessed the only truth that truly mattered. On that quiet frontier, peace did not arrive because one side defeated the other. It arrived because a handful of ordinary people chose courage over pride, mercy over hatred, and truth over fear. And out in the Old West, that was the rarest kind of victory of them all.